As a species, we tend to go all in on resources. From silver and gold rushes to oil booms and rare earth minerals, we tend to speed towards the next big thing that our society can use. Space is no different. As we head towards that next great frontier, governments and private companies alike are looking towards space, and with it, the resources that they need for a successful venture there. But how do we go about it in an environment that is so alien to our own planet? Mining has never been easy, but what new challenges will they face? And how can we do it responsibly for the benefit and with the support of humanity? Our speakers tonight will help us examine these questions from several different perspectives: science, mining, and the law. It is my pleasure to introduce them now. Lindy Elkins-Tanton is leading NASA's Psyche mission and is the director of the School of Earth and Space Sciences at Arizona State University. Tanja Masson-Zwaan is Deputy Director of the International Institute of Air and Space Law at Leiden University and is President Emerita of the International Institute of Space Law. Ingjel Abbud-Madrid is the Director of the Center for Space Resources at the Colorado School of Mines, where he leads a program focused on the human and robotic exploration of space and the utilization of its resources. And the format of this panel will be a discussion between these experts that should prove enlightening, and as I said before, fun. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with our first question. Hello again, everybody.
Hello.
So based on your experiences in this field, what is the one thing that people or countries that are interested in space resources and space resource exploration need to know that they might not have thought of before? So Lindy, let's go ahead and start with you.
I'd like to talk about this question of what do we not yet know from the point of view, beginning from the NASA Psyche mission that I'm leading. NASA is sending robotic space mission to the metal world Psyche. It's an asteroid in the outer asteroid belt that we believe is made 90% on its surface of nickel iron metal. It's like a metal asteroid, and in fact it will be the first metal world that we visit. And so this is the context for my answer to this question as a planetary scientist. We've visited several asteroids that are made of rock, and so we have a little bit better idea what the surface of a rocky asteroid might be like. A metal asteroid we've never visited. We don't even know if there is any regolith, any soil-like or sandy material on the surface of a metal asteroid, something that might, for example, help us mine it, help us get the resources. And so the answer that I want to give is that I think that we have several more critical pieces of information to learn, especially from robotic missions, before we start sending mining missions. I think the asteroids are the right target. They're much easier to go to and leave in terms of gravity, but we need to learn the details of how you approach a small body, how you deal with a funny gravity field, how you actually occupy the surface and then leave it again. These are all attainable answers, but they're answers that we need before we can speak confidently of mining on asteroids.
And Tanja, what about you?
Yeah, I think my answer would be that people are perhaps not always aware that there is something called space law, that we do actually have a set of rules that were developed by the United Nations already 50 years ago, and that govern the conduct of states on outer space and through that also of their private enterprises. So there is a body of law that lays down these broad principles, but there are also many unanswered questions in the legal sense. And the challenge will be to answer those so that in a sustainable and responsible manner these activities could take place if they are feasible. So.
Yeah. And Hal, what about you?
Thank you, Mayor. Assalamu alaikum, masal khair. I hope I said it right. I think it is important, before we get into a conversation like this, to really know what exactly we mean by resources in space. We know that here on Earth, resources have been the main driving force behind exploration and also the means to do so. But what type of resources are there in space? Everybody in this room, in one way or another today, made use of the very first utilized resource in space, and that is the view from above. We have been doing this for 60 years. Why? Because you probably check the weather, you're doing global communications, GPS system that brought you here, and that's not all. I mean, that's the first commercial use of space. It's a $250 billion industry. But what else is out there? Well, we have, like the panel is called, is the gold rush. Why? Because we have gold, silver, platinum, and iridium, and all of those things that Lindy is trying to find out from her mission to an asteroid. But we also have the first oasis in space, and that is water. Water that will be needed for humans, for drinking, for oxygen, for growing plants in the far future. In the near future, water is the oil of space. Why? Because oil helps us for transportation. Water, you can split it into hydrogen and oxygen, and that's what fuels a rocket. So that's going to be one of the near targets. There's also the next Silicon Valley on space, because besides metals, we have silicon, we have rare earth metals that you use in your cell phones and the cars that you brought here today. We also have the conditions to manufacture things in space. We have low gravity, we have ultra-high vacuum, and finally the next energy revolution, because solar energy from space will at some point help us here on Earth to solve our energy problems. So these are all the resources that one has to take into account when you start thinking about going beyond Earth and exploring space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what is very interesting is that we're talking about what we know and what we don't know about space, and there's still so much that is still out there to discover. So, I mean, where are we right now? So what is the current state of our policy development and our science and our technical knowledge? And what can be done to kind of accelerate that? Where do we need to go, and where are we right now? And Hal, why don't we start with you and go back?
Okay, all right. Well, there's, I would say, 3 things that are important for resources, here on Earth or in space. First, you have to know what those resources are and where they are. Second, you have to develop the technology to extract them. And third, as important, is to find a customer. If you don't have those 3, you may have great elements out there, but they're not resources. They cannot be utilized. So I would say that in terms of finding those resources, we have a little bit of data in terms of what's out in the moon, in terms of water. Asteroids, we know a little bit from meteorites. In terms of the technology, we have developed enough to help us now extract oxygen from the moon and other places. But those 2 go hand in hand, because those people that are actually telling us what the resources are need to know what technologies we're developing, and vice versa. And the third, which is the customer, is something that is just starting. And we can talk more about this, but last year there was one of the major launch providers in the world, United Launch Alliance, for the first time announced a price point for buying propellants in the moon and low Earth orbit. So those 3 elements are now working together in parallel and starting this whole process.
Yeah, and what about in terms of law? I mean, where are we in terms, I know that there are some nations that are kind of instituting their own laws regarding space and resources. And then there's also the efforts that you're working on in terms of the international level. Where are we, and what needs to happen next?
Yeah, I think the current state of affairs is that we have a set of treaties that lay out the principles of behavior of states that, for instance, provide that we should cooperate, that space activities should be for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, that exploration and use of outer space are free without discrimination to all, and that we should not put weapons in space, and that we should not contaminate Earth or space. So all these principles we have, and the treaties have been ratified by more than 100 countries. So there's really a set of rules that govern the behavior, and that has kept outer space free of war for the past 60 years since Sputnik went up. what is the next step, I believe, will be this evolution of national legislation that you mentioned. There are currently 2 countries who have issued a national law at the request or at the push of the industry, which needed clarity, which needed some answers, specifically to know whether they would be allowed to own resources that they might at some point harvest, and whether they can then process these resources and sell them and build a station for gas in outer space or whatever the plans might be. So these national laws are, I believe, a first step that have put the item on the agenda, that have immediately led to the United Nations, the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, to also include an item discussing this on its agenda, which was quite revolutionary, because it was really, all states agreed that this was an urgent matter that needed to be addressed. But I believe that the next step will really to come to some international agreement, because even in the interest of the companies that are pursuing this activity, it will be better to have a harmonized system and not one law that applies in one country and another that applies in another country. And if your American law recognizes your rights, in China, they might not be recognized. So there is a need for some harmony and some international consolidation. And so that's why, as you mentioned, we did establish a working group, which is called the Hague Working Group on the Governance of Space Resources. And we have established a set of building blocks, which is in this booklet, the draft building blocks, that we want to open up for the international community to discuss. And I brought copies with me for those who are interested, which really try to put on the agenda among all the main stakeholders what are the issues that we should look at. And without discussing whether this should be a treaty or guidelines or resolutions or in whatever format that should be set, we really wanted to focus on the content. And so this is a first result of that work, which is ongoing for another 2 years. And so that way we're trying to contribute to that international discussion and to get some international agreement that will go beyond the national legislation that has been evolving.
Yeah, and I mean, what in terms, we're talking about, you know, getting the resources out to actually utilize them and who owns them, but how do we even know what's out there?
I think it's very early days in all of these parts of our discussion, very, very early days. And I wish that we had a moment to hear what each of you in the audience was interested in or what drew you here, because I think that so many people are interested in space and what we will do in space, what is the economy of space, and yet it's such early days. And so NASA will be very pleased if I would say the following. Our mission is truly about fundamental science. And when it comes to anything other than what Angel is mentioning about really the near-Earth resources, GPS, solar power, things like that, when you go beyond that and you start thinking about what would we actually extract from the moon or what could we extract from Mars, let alone what could we extract from asteroids, it's such early days. We're still at the stage of understanding the fundamental science to give the sort of information so that Angel and his colleagues could even devise a way that things could be extracted. And so we're at the fundamental science stage where so much can be done robotically to help us understand the material properties and compositions and what we might want. But I would just hark back to some of the conversations earlier today here at the summit about why would people go to space? Why will we have a space future other than that our hearts yearn for a space future? And a lot of it will come down, I think, to resources and tourism. But before we can really think about resources and tourism, we have to understand these bodies we're going to visit. And so, early days.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting point. I mean, we know so little about what's out there. So what is it that we might want to be cautious about disturbing? You know, is there anything that we might not want to disturb for scientific purposes or otherwise?
For me?
Sure.
I think, first of all, about Mars. I would suggest, I would guess that everyone here would say, yes, we're going to colonize Mars. There are going to be people on Mars. I can't wait for there to be people on Mars, except for Tanja, possibly, would say no.
Don't call it a colony.
Sorry, a settlement. We are going to bring a settlement to Mars. But Mars is also one of our very top choices to look for life in our solar system or the existence of past life. And so actually in our lab right now, we're working on where would be the sensitive areas we'd want to be sure not to disturb because we want to be able to examine them later. Do they overlap with resource areas that we would really want to have access to? And how do each of those kinds of areas line up with landing areas? And so I would suggest that here at this summit would be the people who will help us to do this right going into the future, because I think that it gives us a chance to be better humans than we've been here on Earth. These have to be things that we do together internationally in cooperation so that we save for research the parts that need to be researched, and so that we settle and colonize, settle where the places are more conducive for us to be without ruining some scientific aspect. I think for the moon, I think there's also a huge fear that someday we would look up and see something that wasn't our natural moon. And how would we feel about that? And how would that affect us as humans? The emotional aspect of this is as important as the others. And perhaps it's a little facile for me to say, but I mean, we do have hundreds of thousands of asteroids, and there is no such thing as a limitless resource, but there's a good place to start.
And Hel, what do you think? Do you think that if we did actually start mining on the moon, would there be a disturbance that we could see here on Earth?
Well, so that Lindy doesn't get mad at me. No, this is very interesting because Lindy tells me what's out there, then Tanja tells me don't touch this or touch that, and I'm the one that actually gets my hands dirty and goes to mine. But in terms of the moon, you will be glad to know, Lindy, that the first place that we're looking at is at ice on the permanently shadowed craters of the lunar poles. These places have never seen the light of the sun, so don't worry about seeing it from Earth. These are places on the poles that have accumulated ice for billions of years. And where we're trying to go is trying to find out if that's snow, is that combined with the lunar soil, and how is that we can get a whole of that ice to convert it to water, to then convert it to hydrogen and oxygen that will fuel a rocket. So we will try to not disturb the moon that much. And asteroids, well, we cannot see it from here, and maybe, well, you can see it from your mission, but we'll try to keep them clean.
Yeah, and I did think it was interesting. You were reacting quite strongly to the idea of the settlements on the moon, or on Mars. I'm sorry. Is there any law right now governing that? Humans going out and starting to use resources on another planet in situ. It's very important for exploration. But what are some considerations that people might have to think about on those missions?
Well, there are no specific rules that say you can or you cannot make a human settlement. There are possibilities for a settlement to be operated in outer space, and we have already the International Space Station, and you could think of something similar on a celestial body that would actually be quite similar. And the ISS is governed by an international treaty among the 15 states that are working together there. If you are thinking of making a settlement on the moon or on Mars, or if you're thinking about exploring resources on asteroids, I think the question is important: should we have the same rules that apply to them, or should we have a more precautionary approach when we talk about the moon, which we can see, and Mars, which also is an important planet, or those asteroids, which may, by the way, be plentiful, and so they may not be limited resources, but the ones that we can reach might be limited. So it is, of course, not just the number, but also the accessibility that plays a role in deciding whether or not they are scarce resources. And I would be quite interested to eventually develop a special regime with more strict rules for the moon, even though you go to the dark side, that's fine. But the astronomers have interest, there is heritage, there are the footsteps of the first man on the moon. And so I think that is sort of a different story than a piece of rock. But even if a company would mine a piece of rock, I would still advise them always to leave a little bit there, because if not, you might be found in violation of Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says you cannot appropriate by any means a celestial body. And if nothing is left, I would say that sort of becomes an appropriation, and that might be an issue. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I don't think I'd realize that. You have to just leave a little bit for the next person.
It's probably a theoretical issue, but
Okay. No, that's fantastic. And one thing that I know that we have all discussed before is, and what we've kind of started talking about now, is the idea of how do we do this responsibly? When it comes to mining here on Earth, we have not always done the best job when it comes to resource exploration and utilization. So we have another chance here. What are we going to have to do to make sure that we are doing something responsibly for all of humanity? Is there anyone who wants to go first on that one?
Yeah, I would like to say that for me, and this is also what resulted from the discussions of the Hague Working Group, probably the biggest challenge is the sharing of benefits. And that does not necessarily mean that there has to be some kind of financial sharing of profits, because probably that will take still such a long time that is not even interesting for the have-nots, if you like. But there have to be other ways in terms of sharing of technology, capacity building. You can even think of a fund or whatever, but I think that is really the greatest challenge, and that is also something that is a legal obligation under the treaties, that use and exploration of outer space, including the use of its resources, has to somehow benefit mankind. And I think thinking of ways of how to do that will prove to be the success, because if we manage to do that, it will also help the legitimacy and the acceptance of this activity by all countries.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps this is unrealistic, but I can't help but hope that there's an opportunity here to do something a little bit utopian. What if we did bring back a large piece of material and put it into a lunar orbit or a stable orbit? And what if we made the resources available worldwide? What if we could do that as a consortium? I think that it's a moment when, as humans across the globe, we could afford to dream in a little bit of a utopian way, see if we can think of a better way, because there are these opportunities to change many lives at the same time, and not just to follow the tradition of exploration where a single person or a single group is enriched at the cost of others.
I think that's right. It's a very unique time right now because we are just starting on this, but it will help to see where the interest is right now. The talk about space resources about 15, 20 years ago, it was just NASA and a small group. But now you have the Russians and the Indians and the Chinese and the Japanese and a small country in Europe called Luxembourg. And just in October, the United Arab Emirates expressed interest on space resources. So you're starting to see the interest coming internationally. It is not just space agencies, it's also the private sector. The major rocket providers are looking into water for their fuel, and dozens of small companies are now getting interested on how is that they're going to get all these elements. So you're starting to see again this interest of going after it, and you're right, you're going to have to regulate this very closely so that we don't step on everybody's toes. Just to give you an example of what not to touch or how to be careful, the best estimates on the amount of water on the lunar poles is about from 100 million to 1 billion metric tons. If you put that in terms of what humans consume, Americans, which consume a lot of water, if you want to have 10,000 humans on the moon at this point, they will utilize that in 1,000 years. In terms of rockets, that's millions of rockets, but then that begs the question, do we really, this is a finite resource. Should we just use the moon as a stepping stone to go to other places? Or should we just deplete the whole water that has been accumulated for billions of years? So that's a question for humanity to address.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I was interested in, if we're talking about, finite resources, and I think this kind of goes back to the international law aspect of this and the need for some kind of consensus for what to do. I mean, are there any frameworks right now or models in place that we could use as a starting point for deciding how to regulate and kind of allocate these resources going forward?
Well, there is a model, and that may be a model from which we should take positive or negative lessons, but that is the regime for the deep seabed. And there is a convention on the law of the of the sea, and there has been an authority that has been established, the Seabed Authority, which is an international authority that issues licenses to explore the bottom of the deep sea, which also contains many resources supposedly that companies want to explore and exploit. The legal regime that is the basis for that is very contentious and is not adhered to by many states, including those who are currently having industries interested in space mining. And so the United States set up also a separate national law on the deep seabed mining, the Deep Seabed Mining Act. And I find it an interesting fact that there was one company who decided not to file for a license under this American law, but set up a subsidiary company in another country which was party to the convention and filed for a license under the Deep Seabed Authority because it was important for them to have legitimacy. And so I think it is in a way a lesson perhaps not to follow, but there are precedents. You can also think about Antarctica, which is less of a perfect parallel because there's a kind of moratorium on commercial use of Antarctica. But and no analogy is, of course, perfect, but we can certainly learn from some other areas. Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of learning, I mean, all of you are involved in education, and education is definitely a theme that has kept coming up during this summit. So what do people need to know? What do we need to be teaching this current and next generation in order to use these resources responsibly and kind of, keep everything going? What's the most important things for people to be studying, in your opinions?
I think education is the most important thing in the world. I think it's the most important thing that we can all be working on. And to me, the key for moving from what at least in the West has been a system that was started in Prussia and was designed to make a compliant industrial workforce, we need to completely go past that. We need to create a society of thinkers and problem solvers. And so I'm a huge advocate of moving from simple content delivery to teaching the process of recognizing an unsolved problem and understanding how to struggle toward an answer in partial steps and being able to tolerate ambiguity and tolerate failure as simply not having finished yet. These are the kinds of talents and thoughtfulness that we need to create a society of people who will make the right decisions going forward. To me, that's the fundament of it. And if we could combine a sense of empowerment around problem solving and a sense of confidence and agency with, dare I say, some of the things that Deepak Chopra was talking about today, if we could be more emotionally connected and more human-centered, then I think I would have great positive feelings about our future, because I would know that as a society, all of us would be trained to make the right decisions. And so to me, it's not about what you study in terms of content, but what you study in terms of how to have a vision and a mission for your life.
Well, I cannot hide my enthusiasm for space resources. This is something that we're very passionate about, and the opportunities that it can present for humans to continue to use our resources, to continue exploring, and to really expand our economy. And that is why, and I have to make this plug here, a few months ago we launched the very first academic program in the world on space resources at my institution. Because what we want to do is educate not just the technologies, but the scientists, the policy analysts, the economists, and the entrepreneurs on what is that going to be required in order to incorporate space resources into future space architecture. So I think education has to be given on where is that we are right now, where are we heading, and what is going to be needed in order to incorporate a new system. So I'm quite excited about that.
I can imagine. Yeah, I fully agree with my colleagues here, and I think we have a very responsible role in educating, but you also see a super encouraging enthusiasm among young people, and I teach in a program dedicated to air and space law in Leiden, where we have close to 40 young people from all over the world who come together, and it is really wonderful to learn, to see them learn from each other. So I believe that aspect, diversity, having all these different nationalities and learning from their perspectives, but also the interdisciplinarity, I think, is very important. And that's why I love a panel like this, where we have so many different expertises coming together. And that's also what I try to do in my teaching, to bring in scientists and engineers, even though the students get scared, but I tell them you won't get an exam question about this, but I want you to know what is exploration and what is science and engineering. And so I think that those are key words: interdisciplinarity, international cooperation, and mutual understanding. And I think those are important values to impart on the students that we have the honor of teaching. Yeah.
And it is rather amazing how fast everything has moved. This is a field that has, just blossomed and will continue. I think it's right at the cusp of starting something incredible. And I know we can't get to everything in this one short session, but I encourage any of the audience members, if you have questions or would like to speak with the panelists afterwards, I know that they would love to keep talking about it. I know we could talk about it forever, but we are out of time, and so I want to close with a thought. I mean, there is one space resource that we haven't talked about yet, and Hal, would you like to?
I think that Tanja mentioned it, but you probably didn't hear that. We have mentioned all sorts of things, metals and gases and water, but there is one resource that is not just of interest to technologists or scientists, it's interest for all of us, and that is inspiration. Space has a way to inspire people since the beginning of humanity, and so we better use that resource wisely if we want to keep going forward and utilizing these resources appropriately and helping us to continue our exploration of space.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you all for being here this evening, and I'd like to thank our panelists again for joining us. It's been a really wonderful conversation, and I know that we will continue it out at the rest of the summit. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.